It was supposed to be a routine trip, one of many I had taken on that same train line. I was no stranger to long, quiet journeys, passing through small towns and desolate stretches of countryside. But this one would be different, something I could never have prepared for, something I would never forget. It was a cold, foggy morning in late October when I boarded the train at a small station just outside the city. The air felt heavier than usual, damp and thick with the kind of cold that gets into your bones. I'd been up late the night before and hadn't had much sleep, but I was looking forward to the ride. Nothing too eventful, just another trip to visit family in the rural town up the line. The train, an old model with a mix of new and worn components, had a faint smell of must and diesel. I found my seat, stowed my bag above, and settled in by the window. The train started moving slowly, easing its way out of the station, its heavy wheels grinding against the tracks. Outside, the landscape was a blur of trees and fields, with only the occasional flash of a distant farmhouse or a lonely road. I nodded off almost immediately. Lulled by the repetitive motion of the train and the comforting hum of the engine, I woke up abruptly, disoriented. The train was now passing through a stretch of forest, deep woods with barely any signs of human presence. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. The usual clatter and chatter of passengers were absent. I glanced around, but the train car was empty, save for one elderly man sitting across the aisle from me, staring out the window with a vacant look on his face. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled me. There was a strange stillness in the air, as though the very environment had paused. Holding its breath, I turned back to the window. The fog had thickened, and I could no longer see much beyond a few feet of the train. The trees loomed like specters in the haze, casting long shadows across the tracks. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but the screen was completely blank. It wasn't just the phone. Every electronic device on the train was dead, including the overhead lights, which flickered ominously before going out completely. The train's only light now came from the dim, flickering emergency bulbs. Panic began to settle in my stomach. I tried to push the feeling down, telling myself it was probably just a technical issue. But the longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. The air seemed thicker, heavier, and there was a faint sound like a whisper, coming from somewhere in the distance. I couldn't tell if it was the wind, the train's wheels on the tracks, or something else altogether. When the train slowed to a stop, I was relieved, thinking that maybe we had reached a station. I looked out the window, but there was nothing but darkness beyond the tracks. It was as if the world had ceased to exist beyond the boundaries of the train. I stood up and walked toward the door, intending to speak with the conductor. But when I reached the end of the car, I froze. A shadow moved past me, just out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Confused, I turned back to the door and saw it. A figure standing at the very end of the train car. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing black coat, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She was tall, unnaturally so, and her posture was rigid, almost inhuman. I took a step back, but before I could move further, the woman's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide open, her expression twisted in an emotion I couldn't identify. It was as if she had been waiting for me. Her voice came next, low and cold. "You shouldn't be here." I couldn't respond. The words stuck in my throat, and a chill ran down my spine. My instinct told me to run, but I felt rooted to the spot. I watched as she stepped closer, moving with an unnatural grace, gliding toward me like a shadow on the move. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished into the thin air. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I had to force myself to turn and walk back toward my seat. When I returned to my seat, I realized that time had passed, though how much, I couldn't say. I glanced at my phone again. It was still dead. My watch, too, had stopped. The world outside the train had become an inky void. No stars, no moon, just a pitch-black sky. Suddenly, the train lurched forward again, its wheels clattering noisily as it picked up speed. I noticed that the elderly man across the aisle was still staring out the window, his expression unchanged. He didn't seem to react at all to the strange happenings around him. I tried to shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. The train was moving faster now, its engine growling like something alive. The air grew colder, and I could hear something tapping softly against the windows, like fingernails scraping the glass. I turned, my heart racing, but I saw nothing as the minutes passed. The sensation of unease turned into something far more sinister. The silence became unbearable. I could feel eyes on me, though I was alone in my car. The whispers, too, grew louder. Indistinct murmurs, like a conversation happening just out of reach. I stood up again, desperate to escape the claustrophobic atmosphere, and made my way to the door. As I passed the elderly man, I noticed that his eyes were no longer vacant but wide with terror. His mouth moved, forming words that I couldn't hear. His face contorted in silent pleading. I reached the door and tried to open it. It wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, my pulse quickening, but the door remained locked. Frustration and panic surged within me. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response, only the oppressive silence. It was then that I heard it. A loud, guttural growl, deep and menacing, emanating from the engine room. The train shook violently as if something massive was moving within it. My heart nearly stopped in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there, struggling to open the door, but when I finally turned around, I saw something that froze me in place. The train car had changed. The walls were no longer the familiar interior of a train. Instead, they were dark, covered in mold and grime. The lights flickered wildly, casting long, sinister shadows. The floor beneath my feet seemed to pulse, as though the train itself was alive, breathing in time with the growing growl from the engine. Then I saw them, figures in the darkness, moving just beyond the reach of the dim light. They were tall, cloaked in shadows, their faces hidden. One of them stepped closer, and I could hear the distinct sound of their breath, ragged and uneven. I backed away, my body trembling in fear. That's when I understood. The train wasn't moving through space, it was moving through time. And not just time, but something far worse. It was stuck in a place between life and death. The spirits of those who had died aboard this train were trapped here, unable to escape. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground as the shadowy figures began to surround me. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, hear their whispering voices in my ears, urging me to join them. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the train lurched again, this time to a stop. The figures faded into the shadows, and the growling noise ceased. Everything fell silent, as if the train had come to a halt in the middle of an endless void. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet and forced the door open with all the strength I could muster. As soon as I stepped out, I found myself standing on the tracks in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fog and darkness. The train was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, too terrified to move. But when I finally dared to look around, I realized that the landscape had changed. The woods had given way to barren land, and in the distance, I could just make out the outline of a forgotten station. It was a station I had never seen before, but I knew that it was where the train had come from. The train that had taken me to a place where the living and the dead were trapped in a never-ending journey. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned faces. They told me I had been found unconscious by the side of the tracks, miles away from where the train was supposed to be. But I knew the truth. I had escaped, but not everyone on that train had been so lucky. Years have passed since that night, but the memories still haunt me. I've tried to tell others about the train, the eerie figures, the whispers, but no one believes me. They tell me it was just a dream, a result of too much stress and lack of sleep. But I know the truth.